We reside in our bodies differently than we reside in our minds. Our bodies are our vehicles, while our minds are the drivers or the passengers. Sometimes it's safe to say we're manning the ship, but others we may only be a pair of hands of the crew. A few times we may feel like hostages. It's in this uncertainty from moment to moment, unsure of your control of yourself and your surroundings, that this fear forms. Bathed in sensory input you can seldom ignore, anxiety and fear become a natural part of life for most of us. Others can ignore the swaths of sensation and feel no inclination to ponder fear or anxiety or the nature of consciousness. If you're like me and feel no relation to the second group, join me in this conversation exploring the ways we are all afraid. We have clinical names for phobias, but I suspect they're the furthest thing from clinical. When we describe diseases, mostly of the body, we're describing damage or failure of a system that causes certain symptoms and has a certain cause. But I don't think that phobias and fears work the same way, or at least they contain far too many variables to be described as efficiently as diseases. I think of Pavlov's dogs, an experiment done on, you guessed it, dogs, to see if Pavlov could get them to perform an unconditioned response to a conditioned stimulus. He postulated that dogs don't need to learn to salivate in the presence of food. It's an innate or unconditioned response to food, an unconditioned stimulus. Then he introduced a conditioned stimulus. Whenever he brought them food, he would ring a bell. His hypothesis was that he could condition the dogs to salivate when their unconditioned stimulus was not present, but the conditioned one was. And it worked. The dogs would salivate at the sound of the bell, even with no food present. This may seem a little unempathetic, me comparing people's fears with an experiment done on dogs, but the truth is, we don't work that much differently from them. Both species have had the same evolutionary pressure to develop mental responses to their environments. Basically, both humans and dogs generally don't want to die, and thus our psychology works similarly. Albeit with humans, ours are much, much more complex and developed. Conditioning doesn't only work in the presence of something positive, it can also work with something negative, something you are afraid of or adverse to. Vsauce did an incredible minefield episode that showed this perfectly, with an experiment they did right in the episode.
The goal of this procedure is to condition me to be scared of something I've never feared before, a mundane, harmless, geometric shape.
But I'm not going to talk too much about that experiment because I want real fear conditioning, how we develop fears and phobias in the real world. As was the case in my last scientific video, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a leading authority on this subject or any subject to talk about overall, scientific or not. I'm just simply here to talk about something otherwise scientific and maybe get you to think a little bit differently than you did before. Not in a way opposite from the general scientific consensus, but in a way that runs congruent to it. To think about these things from an empathetic and philosophical perspective. When I think of fear, I don't just think of innate biological aversion. And when I think of phobias, I don't just think of illogical fear. I mean, I think that in many ways, innate fears are just that, innate. They're built into us like an operating system. You boot up the system, or just exist, and the fear is there. And phobias are like files you've had forever and you can't get rid of. They're not built into your computer, but they're also not going anywhere, nor do you have any idea where they came from. But I believe that these can overlap, and the ways they do tells us a lot about what it means to be human. But I'll get into that later. At its core, we think of fear as an evolutionary adaptation to danger. When we are in danger, we feel fear. Our heart rate speeds up, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And we would feel fear when exposed to danger, something larger than us, something that looks like it can kill us, something that we don't understand. But phobias go against this logic. We can become afraid of anything, like I said before, with fear conditioning. You can be afraid of a very particular thing, of bathing, of mirrors, of long words, of hair, of string, of small holes or big holes, etc. These all seem like very strange things to be terrified of. You might be thinking to yourself, how weird or messed up or attention-seeking those people have to be if they're going to have those phobias. I wonder if you'd say the same thing about a dog that salivates when it hears the ding of a bell. Because I see no difference here. I'm going to go off on a different tangent here, but I promise it's going to make sense. Take dissociative identity disorder, DID, for example. This condition is the result of a child who experiences intense trauma at a very young age, and their developing mind coped with it by creating multiple identities within the same mind and body. However, this person or system and all of their identities would have no memory of the trauma. Their mind has spent all their life trying to keep them from experiencing the trauma that they cannot recall what it was. I'm not going to go any deeper into this condition in this video, but I'd be happy to make another video on this topic once I've done sufficient research. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd want to see. But keeping this in mind, wouldn't it be entirely possible that someone with a phobia would have experienced something intensely traumatic, coped with it by forgetting about the trauma, and simply associated that fear with some arbitrary thing that also happened to be happening at the same time? Like they were bathing, or looked in a mirror, or it somehow involved long words, etc. Isn't it possible that the phobia isn't the fear, but instead the dinging of the bell? And what about where the line between fear and phobia blur, where the existential evolutionary danger isn't present, but the logic of fear still applies? Like how I'm terrified of loneliness. I don't think that being alone or lonely will kill me. I just find loneliness extremely unpleasant. Maybe it's more of a fear of being alone perpetually, that I'll spend years or even decades being by myself. I mean, maybe even that has evolutionary pressure to be a fear. Humans are social animals. We find fossils of early humans that had injuries that had healed, despite that without the care of another human, it would have been a death sentence. If this person was alone when they were injured, a social outcast, they just would have died. There's one more thing that I'm afraid of that I don't think I'd feel if I weren't human. I've explained away a lot of human psychology with blanket statements and explanations as if what we're feeling isn't special, like our psychology is just more complex manifestations of rudimentary evolutionary adaptations. But it isn't. It's special because it shows us how far we've come. That over millions of years, as our brains grew more complex layer by layer, we still held on to where we came from. But now I think it's time I talked about where we're going. I'm afraid of other people being alone. I'm afraid of other people experiencing hardship I never wish on my worst enemy. I'm afraid of other people being afraid. And I can't think of a good reason I'd feel this if it weren't the fact that I'm human. That I look out into the world seeing all these other humans and imagining myself in their situations. I don't think I'd call this feeling pity. It might be easy to jump to calling it that, but I don't think it is. I think it's the other side of hope. I think it's what happens when you lock hope in a room with humans suffering as the ambiance. I feel like every video I write comes to this point. Finishing the video off with some sappy motivational speech about unification and empathy and love. And I don't think I'm going to stop ending them like this. Because when I type those last keys and scroll back up to proofread, it's like I'm alone again. Because as long as I'm writing, I'm talking to you. So if I know I'm going to be alone again soon, I might as well make sure you feel less alone finishing the video than when you clicked on it. And maybe that's enough. Thanks for watching.